Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. Our guest today is Fernando Gil, the Director of Music at St. Peter's Cathedral in Kansas City, Kansas. He joins us to talk about the music of a unique location in the context of Mexican sacred music, the Cathedral in Puebla. Gil founded and directed the Schola Cantorum Angelopolitana at the cathedral in Puebla before coming to the U.S. He shares with us aspects of the practice in Puebla, and we focus on the music of one of Puebla's most important musical figures, Juan Gutiérrez de Padilla. All of this serves as a prelude to our online Spanish workshops that the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music is offering starting this upcoming Saturday, February 21st, 2026. For 3 Saturdays in a row at 9 a.m. Pacific, that's 12 noon Eastern, Fernando Gil will offer sessions on the basics of church teaching on sacred music. At the end of April and the beginning of May, we'll have another 3 sessions on 3 Saturdays with Professor Sandra Bengochea, our professor of vocal pedagogy here at CISM, on the basics of vocal technique. The sessions can be accessed live via Zoom or with archived video access available in perpetuity. There's also a parish rate for priests and music directors who would like to gather everyone in their parish to attend the class together. Check out our website, catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. Click on events. And now, on to the interview. It's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me today, Fernando.
Of course, I'm glad to be sharing my experience, and, it's always delightful to talk about these topics.
So I would like to start by having you tell us about the foundation of the city of Puebla de Los Angeles in Mexico and the origins of the cathedral there, because it bears on our topic quite importantly. And so I don't know how familiar our audience is with Puebla. So if you could give us a little background, and especially as it relates to the cathedral, we'd be grateful.
So it was the first city that the Spaniards built for themselves. It was built from scratch. Other cities, such as Mexico City, for example, they were built upon other indigenous settlements. And it's so important because that specific spot, it's a fertile plain on a valley called back in the days Tlaxcuapan. And it was between the states of Tlaxcala and the city of Cholula and Cuantichen. So it's pretty much in between Mexico City and Veracruz, which was the port of entrance from all the ships from Spain. So the Spanish crown at that point wanted, a model city for the Spanish settlers. Actually, the word Puebla means just settling, right? Like a human settling. So it's interesting. From the very beginning, the layout of the city, it was just like a grid with rectangular blocks and a central plaza, which we called Zócalo, a large lot set aside right next to it, which was the terrain in which the actual cathedral was built. The urban planning, so to speak, was around that or those two political forces, right? The secular government dominated by the Zócalo or the central plaza, and also this terrain which was reserved for a big cathedral. So the first parish church went up very quickly in the 1530s, facing that Zócalo or that main square, main plaza. By 1535, the community requiring a larger church, or more dignified, so to speak. So the current cathedral project began formally in 1575 under the architect Francisco Becerra. The work for that was very slow because it was very expensive. Most of the people should know now that Puebla's cathedral is actually larger in size than Mexico City. The cathedral was consecrated in the mid-17th century under the ruling of Juan de Palafox in Mendoza. Although the towers weren't completed until the 18th century. So when we talk about the cathedral, we're talking about a building that condenses a whole project of New Spain, a planned Spanish city, a powerful diocesan center, and of course, later on it became also a musical liturgical center.
Yeah, so let's talk about that now. Can you tell us about the origins of the music program at the cathedral, and I mean, how did it end up attracting such an illustrious string of directors during that colonial era?
Yes, so very early on, Puebla became one of the most important, like I said, centers in New Spain. Its only rival around the block, it will be Mexico City. So of course, they were like requiring highly talented musicians to provide music for such a church. They follow the traditional Spanish cathedral model, which is a structured musical chapel with a maestro de capilla, with some singers, choir boys, which they were called later seises, traditionally in Puebla and also other cathedrals around Mexico. And in Spain, this system was like pretty sort of an engine to create highly skilled musicians, professional musicians. So other cathedrals in Spain, such as Toledo, Sevilla, Salamanca, they were functioning pretty much like conservatories, forming composers and also singers and organists from a very early childhood. It's a very interesting way to understand music education nowadays. Most people believe, okay, how do you make the people sing? How do you make maestros de capilla or music directors for our churches around here? Well, you need to start training them on an early age. I know that you will share those thoughts with me. But
Indeed.
but yes, so that's the purpose of that structure, to model those skills from very early ages. So Puebla invested heavily in this by the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The cathedral chapter was recruiting talent from Spain and Portugal, and also nurturing local musicians. On a previous conversation that I had with you, I was telling you about Francisco de Benavente, this Franciscan friar, which actually he was the celebrant for the first mass for the foundation of Puebla. And he was writing to the king in Spain saying, hey, just 40 years after that, he was writing and saying, well, now our capilla, our musicians, our choir can be at the same level of the royal chapel that you have in Spain. So that's something that we can think about, musical education, but also how the natives received the European model music.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the architecture of the cathedral itself. If you could speak a little bit about maybe the choir as the architectural concept here, but also, what sort of structures did they have on the campus? I mean, were they housing boys, and where did they attend classes? And do you know about that sort of auxiliary pedagogical architecture in the school?
Let's talk about first for the cathedral, right? It's large and quite tall. It's a Latin cross plan, thick stone walls and high vaults. So it provides beautiful reverberation, but also it's very challenging to be there, although it's perfect for chant and polyphony. The most important musical space, as you said, is the coro, the choir, which is not like a balcony as we're accustomed to. But let's think about the Latin cross plane. So right before the center of the cross, there's the main altar. And then some feet away from that, right in front of the altar, it's this elongated rectangle within the walls of the cathedral. And that holds choir stalls for the chapter in the number of 52, actually 53, because there's one presidential chair for the bishop. Those are beautifully inlaid with wood and such. Every chair has highly detailed patterns. And so everybody will know, like, it is my chair, right? Because it was structured after a hierarchy of the chapter in Puebla. There's a large lectern in the center of it. and it's designed to hold giant choir books, mostly for Gregorian chant, but there are also polyphonic choir books. Those big books, some from the 16th century, show how the liturgy was still sung in that communal way. So everybody will gather around that lectern and read the antiphons and such. So around that elongated rectangle, they used to have two organs. So one on the gospel side, one on the epistle side. So the capilla there was also having musicians, not only singers and choir boys or canons as well. So the musicians will occupy the spaces upstairs, not where the canons were sitting, but upstairs, what we call tribuna, tribune, next to the organs. So that tells you how complex the space is, and also how complex the music will sound in there when it's historically performed. So that architecture is not neutral. It shapes the music, as I said. And that's why there are lots of music that are like for double choir, triple choir. Okay, but how that ended up being like that? Well, because they were facing each other. And the composers and maestros de capilla there, they will play along with those intentionalities of the architecture. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. So where was instruction happening? Did they have a separate school attached to the cathedral complex? Were there people housed on campus?
So yeah, that's also another part. So we do not know for certain a lot of information about that. But, the cathedral is big enough to have some rehearsal spots and such. Let's also think that all the singers at that point in time in history, there were boys, there were male individuals. Most of them, and some maestros de capilla, were also priests. So it wasn't that much of a problem to have them around. But also there are other facilities, other buildings around the cathedral that could help them, such as the Casa del Deán, or Dean's house, or the Biblioteca Palafoxiana, which was the blessed Juan de Palafox y Mendoza, which was the bishop of Puebla around that time. It was the first public library in America. So in the whole continent, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, so imagine that, like a bishop went, okay, let's make this happen, and let's donate all my library so it could be a public access. So there was some colegios, for example, the Colegio del Espíritu Santo, around those terrains, that they could help those people that they were singing what we know, or the divine office, what we know now as the liturgy of the hours. So they will come together with a choir of canons to sing along with them.
Let's talk about one of the most famous maestros de capillas, Juan Gutiérrez de Padilla. And of course, if anyone's ever sung any of his music, you know that he is doing exactly what you're talking about with double choir, triple choir stuff. But could you tell us a little bit about Padilla?
Of course. So Juan Gutiérrez de Padilla was born in Malaga, in Spain. It was the south of Spain, around 1590. We say around, right? At those points, we only know that because he wrote that his testament that he was born in that year. His parents placed him as a choir boy in the Colegio de San Sebastián, there in Malaga Cathedral, under Francisco Vázquez, which was the maestro de capilla there. And he learned, as we were saying previously, all the skills that a maestro de capilla will have to know, such as the canto llano, or plain chant, and also the canto de órgano, which is polyphony as we understand it in the modern way, literally the standard foundation for every cathedral musician. So in 1612, he became maestro de capilla de Colegiata Church of Jerez de la Frontera. And a few years later, he was appointed the chapel master of Cadiz Cathedral. He had already experienced in that ecclesiastical liturgical world and music. So it was between 1620 and 1622 that he moved to Puebla de Los Ángeles. At that moment, the maestro de capilla there was Gaspar Fernández. but he was aging, and he requested to the chapter that he will need an assistant, and he named Padilla as his preferred candidate. And the cathedral chapter hired him as a cantor and assistant in 1622. And then after Gaspar Fernandez's death, he was appointed maestro de capilla in 1629. He held that until his death in 1664. So it was a long time.
Yeah. So what were the musical forces that he had at his fingertips when he was at the cathedral? How many choir boys did he have there? Were both organs there already at that time?
So by the mid 17th century, Padilla had considerably human and material resources. Let's remember that because Puebla was a city built for the Spaniards themselves, they put a lot of effort in embellishments and all sorts of richness around the city. Some documents of the chapter indicate that around 1645, he oversaw 14 choir boys and 28 adult singers. That's substantial for standards of that time. So add that to the two organists and ministriles, which were wind players, and sometimes string players as well. You can imagine that, like in the whole liturgical cycle, that's a dream for us, right? To have that amount of people committed and even paid for doing such a thing. That was the forces that he was having. And that's why he was able to compose. In the archive, we have 145 music books and small volumes with his music.
Yeah. So can we talk a little bit about his output? Was it masses, motets, magnificats, polyphonic hymns, that sort of stuff? What was he composing?
So let's remember also that at that point, and I think we can take that as a model, every maestro de capilla was looking back to those predecessors' music, and they were using music from a century ago or 2 centuries ago, and also at the same time composing music for the rites. So he wrote masses. The most famous mass is the Missa Ego Flos Campi, which is believed to be based on a plain chant melody, unknown origins. And, just let me place a side note there, because most of the musicological works and researchers that they have come to the cathedral, they just cover the polyphony, and they want that to be transcribed and performed. And let's think that was at the same level of the plain chant, so, or Gregorian chant. At that point, we need to understand that people say, like, well, that information is lost now. We don't know the melody. Well, it might be lost in some of those choir books that nobody touches that contain plain chant. So it must be there. And also, it's believed that this Missa Ego Flos Campi was the mass for the dedication of the new cathedral. The credo, the treatment of the credo, this is a mass for double choir. So we have these alternating choirs. And on the credo, for example, he puts the word credo several times. And it's believed that the number of repetitions has to do with the realms of angels in heaven, somewhat representing or trying to say, we're doing this for Puebla de los Ángeles, of the angels.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that? Is it included as a sort of inserted word? Because, of course, the incipit for the credo would have belonged to the celebrant of the Mass. But how is it incorporated when it's not usually a word sung by the choir?
Yes, that's very interesting. So, for example, of course, the celebrant will intone, as you just said, and then the choir will continue, Patrem omnipotentem factorem celi et terre. And then second choir enters and they just say, credo, I do believe. And then visibilium omnium et invisibilium. And then the choir, credo. Et in unum Dominum, that's first choir, et in unum Dominum Jesum Christum. And then they will, say, I do believe. Credo again.
That's really interesting. Is this something that you see in other works from Mexico generally or from Puebla? Because, you don't really see that in the European works.
Not really. And that's one of the things that we can talk about his creativity and his unique position in missionary territory, but also in one of the richest cathedrals in Mexico, or in New Spain, better to say. So this is very interesting. And the treatment of the whole Mass is also very rhythmical. Like it's almost spark. You can feel it's a festive Mass. That's why the most recent studies, it is believed that it was the music that they will hear for the dedication of the church. Alongside, he wrote motets, lamentations for Holy Week, psalms, litanies, Marian antiphons, and some villancicos. This is a very interesting genre of paraliturgical music.
Indeed. Maybe emphasis on the para.
Yes. Exactly, because it was only allowed because New Spain was a territory of mission, as I said before. So those villancicos were composed in the vernacular, and sometimes they will include little bits of Latin phrases, or they will use a mixture of native languages and Spanish, or even like other transformations for the Afro community in New Spain, for example. So those ethnic compositions were meant to be sung on the top of the chapter reciting some psalms in Latin. And it was because, that a sense of mission, that we need to tell all the people what we are believing in and what we are praising for, and what God will give thanks to.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The villancicos that I'm most familiar with are those of Guerrero. So obviously there must have been a Spanish tradition, a European tradition that they were drawing on. But it seems like this might be some area in which the particularly American aspects of the composition are felt. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that villancico tradition from Spain, and ways in which that musical style embodied sort of American characteristics when it was used and composed here.
Yes, so that tradition, and actually, let's place another side note here, because most of the Hispanic people, we will understand in a modern way that word, villancico, which is just Christmas music. It could be either devotional, or it could be just even like secular.
Right.
So
Often about burritos, right?
exactly, like the burrito sabanero or something like that. So that has nothing to do, or little to do, about those compositions that we're talking about in this occasion, right? So yes, there are Christmas villancicos of that era, but they were meant to be sung in high solemnities, such as Corpus Christi, for example, and we have villancicos for that. And in the lyrics of them, we can see those efforts not only to provide some sort of novelty, so to speak, to the like rhythmically novelty. There's a subgenre of the villancicos, which is precision villancicos, in which the text will provide you of the musical notes, like do, re, mi, fa, sol, like hitting in between the text, for example, porque me iluminó el a mí. And we have el a mí there, right? Or porque me iluminó el sol. We have sol there. So those things were very challenging, and sometimes very famous writers or poets in New Spain, they will have a stipend to provide the text to the maestros de capilla. Now, those, like I said, they were in efforts to let the people know, to evangelize them, to let them know what Catholicism was. And I always extend a little bit when talking about this, because sometimes it has been, at least in Mexico, the education, either public or private, they will tell you it's pretty reductionist to say like, okay, the Spaniards were bad and the native were good, and pretty much that's it. But that legend is kind of destroyed once you start working with those villancicos that they were singing there, because the church was preoccupied was taking care of all the people in there. And it was at some point very complex, the demographics in those cities in New Spain. So it wasn't just like the Spaniards and then the slaves and then the native. No, it was really, really, really complex. We had caste system that was held in those areas, and it was very, very, very complex. But the church was providing text and providing music for all the demographics. That's why we have villancicos in Nahuatl. That's why we have other dialects. We have what we call Español negreado, for example, which is that Spanish that the Afro slaves they will use. So in the cathedral, in the church, everybody was there listening and participating as sons of God. That's very interesting. And it's very different from what happened in other countries that they were under the ruling of Protestant crowns. So it's very interesting to think about that.
Yeah. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit too about the subjects of the texts. Again, going back to my experience with Guerrero, the texts that deal with reception of Holy Communion are really profound, asking to be cleansed of sin lest I be struck dead upon reception of the Blessed Sacrament, these sorts of things. They seem to be very strong in catechizing them, not only about the nature of what was going on in the liturgy, but about the spiritual disposition one ought to have in the liturgy.
Yes, so there are like several texts. In New Spain, the texts were kind of adapted. I would not say dumbed down because they're like complex as well, but they were explaining in plain language what they were believing. Sometimes they were like really festive and almost playful. I'm thinking about some of them. And yeah, sometimes it's just like really playful, in which, for example, the Afro community will, kind of joke about the color of the skin and still saying like, oh yes, but Jesus is still our brother, even though we're not of the same color of the skin, and that kind of things. Those topics were covered as well, right? It sounds crazy to think about that in our actual context, but back in the days, that was really helpful to understand, or to make them understand, that they were also sons of God. And about the other villancicos for Corpus Christi, for example, they were really deep in nature, in the nature of the text. Of course, there are other texts. There's a text from Sor Juana Inés, and if I recall correctly, it comes from a villancico for Christmas. She says, siendo de ángeles la Puebla en el nombre y en el todo, no pudo ser menos que de ángeles también el coro. So being Puebla, a city of angels, it cannot be other but to be of angels also the choir. Pretty much like that's a rough translation. Yeah. But it tells you they were also very proud of the city. So the text come from several different contexts, but the true root of or nature of them was always that catechesis, all the people that were attending the services.
Yeah. So can we go back to Padilla a little bit, and can you talk a little bit about the characteristics of his overall output? Is it that when he was writing masses and motets that they sounded more European, and when he's writing villancicos or more devotional pieces that they sound more like they're from New Spain? And what are the differences between those different styles?
Well, I will say when you put that in the context of, like you said, Guerrero or even Victoria, we can see that exuberance in the polychoral writing, as we were describing the Missa Ego Flos Campi, for example. It's just like, I believe like it's the same as the organs, right? They are built upon the musical space. So since he had that huge space with two organs, with a lot of choristers and ministriles, they're often, the polychoral works are often grand and spatial, and sometimes like sparkling in rhythm, as we were talking about, the villancicos, they have these colonial identities. So all the subgenres of them, like I said, for Nahuatl and other native languages, but also dialects from the African or other demographics, ethnics. So he kind of adds and integrates in a very creative way those popular gestures, so to speak, popular musical gestures. And you can see that difference when you're listening to his Latin works. He writes those in a very controlled Renaissance counterpoint, very reminiscent of Victoria and Guerrero, as we were talking. And in the villancicos, instead, you can hear more direct, catchy rhythms, clearer phrasing and refrains. And I mean, it is pretty fun to hear those and even to sing some of those. So that was a theatrical impact for the community. So sometimes those villancicos are also using onomatopoeias to blend with other contrapuntal techniques, with those onomatopoeias which are often dance-like sounds and idioms. I think those will be the most important characteristics of Padilla's music.
Yeah. So obviously Padilla was part of a huge heritage, which had a long line. But what do you think the heritage is and the takeaway for modern Mexicans from his music? Can they take away as their own, or does it seem like something that's kind of just a relic of a colonial past?
Well, I think it's very important for us as liturgical musicians, as Mexican musicians, to know these kind of works. Often in the Hispanic or among the Hispanic community, it is sensed that we have always like highly rhythmic and dumbed down texts and such. But when you have or are in contact, when people are in contact with this kind of music, you can see that this is our actual heritage as Hispanics, not only as Mexicans, but in the Hispanic world, because there were great maestros de capillas in Guatemala, for example, in other places. So I think it's our own history sounding and being preserved in some sort of musical box, which is the cathedral. It's kind of a metaphor of who we are today, which is a mixture of those European, of those Afro, and of those indigenous people that we're made of. We're not just like, there are people that they believe that, and it's some sort like, it's a kind of a half ideological and half cultural that there are people in there like, oh, no, my grandparents, they were from Spain. Right. And there are people, oh, no, my grandparents, they were like indigenous. And there are people like, they're like very proud, but in reality, we're all mixed. And it's not only that, but even we had Asian communities back in the days and right now. So we are a mixed, and that legacy reflects that reality from the very beginning, when we were just New Spain and not even Mexico. So that culture, that complex of identity, it's a living heritage that we need to understand, and we can reappropriate that in the modern day. That should be used in our churches.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit. So you've been in the US only a few years, and you are working both with English speaking and Spanish speaking communities at the Cathedral of St. Peter in Kansas City, Kansas, not to be confused with Kansas City, Missouri. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you find that the people that you work with identify with in this tradition that you're trained in. I mean, you were at the cathedral in Puebla before you came here, right? So what we're talking about here was really in your blood, and just your daily living as a music director there. And is there an openness to that sort of tradition now? Is there a love of it? Is it a work in progress What's your experience?
Well, being here just a few years, like you said, it's a work in progress for sure. But it is beautiful to see that our people is more inclined to accept this when you explain the reasons of it and when you actually explain their own history. We need to say this probably in the 19th century, there was a decay in the quality of liturgical music in most of the Hispanic countries. And then this was aggravated by a misinterpretation of the Vatican II. So now the actual problem in Mexico in other Hispanic countries is that they believe the tradition it comes from the 1960s, and for sure the musicians at that point they didn't have the training because it was broken in the 19th century, that tradition of the maestros de capilla and that formation that we were talking about, that education. So there are some texts that they will contain theological errors and mistakes and misinterpretations, or there will be music that appeals more to catchy rhythms or even to the feelings instead of truly liturgical music. And so what I'm trying to do is to balance. Actually, I'm doing the same thing that I was doing in Puebla, that I was collaborating with the Puebla's Cathedral, whereas I was the music director for a suburb parish in there. That model needs to reflect that complex identity of our Hispanic heritage. So we're incorporating the propers for with modern composers, but we are also coming back and revisiting some motets in Spanish, some villancicos in Spanish. You need to be really careful not to overdo it because we're not longer a territory of mission in the sense that they have in the 16th century, but we are having something to do with mission right now, and we need to focus more with that, and also starting to build a bridge across generations. What the maestros de capilla they were doing back in the days. I'm looking back not only for my previous century music composers, but we are looking back for 300 years ago, 400 years ago, what they were doing, because that's a proved route to establish a musical program. Also, and let me highlight this, to have that sense of continuous education, we need to understand also that the choir was built around the divine office. So having that in a cathedral context, even though it's hard to do it right now, we do not have the resources that Padilla had back in the days, commitment issues and all sort of challenges. But still, if we can provide that to our communities, that's something, like I said, that is proven to work from back in the days.
Yeah. It's just so true of so many cultures now that the music education is not what it used to be in the general public. And so there are so many issues of just teaching people how to sing and use their voice for the first time or read music, all of these sorts of things. I think this is a sort of universal problem in the modern era. But do you find that there are particular ways in which you are finding success in tackling those issues in the communities you're serving?
Yes, I think so. To start with, just providing texts of quality and music of quality to the people, you can see and start to see the transformation, because sometimes we forgot that we, first of all, we're part of the congregation. As a choir, we need to help them to improve their prayer and their later extent, their own interior life. So whenever we have that in mind, then you start to see they also have this repertoire, but is that deep enough? Sometimes we believe that we need to dumb down things so that people will understand. But I think it's the opposite way. We need to challenge the congregation to accept deeper texts that will help them. People come here to find something that we cannot find elsewhere. So if we instead provide them salsa style music or mariachi style music, well, those rhythms and those genres we can hear elsewhere, and ultimately it can be dangerous because it could remind us of the context of those genres, such as a ballroom, such as a bar. So culturally, I believe it's wrong to bring those rhythms into the liturgical world. But there are certain ways in which we can do that. Sometimes, as I was talking about Padilla's music, sometimes it's just a rhythm. Sometimes it's just a musical gesture that is just like a blink to our Hispanic origins. But in a context in which is treated within not only a counterpoint, but within a melody which is dignified and with a proper text, we can certainly assess deeper problems, not just the quality of music, right? But that's the mission of the choir. So having to translate that, it's already challenging. But I can see that there's good improvement in how the people are receiving that, because we're giving them back what it's their own heritage.
Right. Thank you so much for this, Fernando. It's been great to chat with you. And I'm excited to hear from our listeners as they discover the music of Padilla. Do you have any resources that you might point them to in particular if they want to learn more about Padilla or the musical heritage in Puebla or Mexico more generally?
So a book to read about the cultural environment of New Spain, it will be La Conquista Musical de México by Lourdes Torrent. You can have an ebook. Also, there's the repository of research and education about art of the Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes, which is accessible online on invadigital.bellasartes.gov.mx, and also on academia.edu. You have the catalog of works of Puebla's Cathedral Musical Archive, which I had the honor to collaborate with Aurelio Tello, which is one of the authorities in New Spain's music. That's accessible online as well. But there are several books accessible for free in that repository of research and education.
That's great. Thank you so much, Fernando. And I look forward to having you back on the show.
I'll be glad to. Thank you so much for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.